Az A-ban, nem?
Igen.
Tök egyedül vagyok.
Hello.
Hi, Reina. Here.
I missed the time.
10 to something, yeah? 10 to the hours
Okay.
of your time zone.
So we have like
almost
45 minutes here.
45.
Yeah. Okay.
Just wait a few minutes while people arrive. And what I will do, I try to put the questions, yeah, just to make it easier. I put the metadata questions into the chat box because we don't see them anymore on the thumb page, yeah?
Yeah, they're also in the Google Doc.
Yeah, so they're in the Google Doc, but if someone doesn't want to open the Google Doc, I decided to put it here, so.
Yeah.
No. And yeah, then I suggest that we are maybe ready to go. So during the, I do not know which working method we choose because we have a two session part. So maybe we can use 20 minutes for each, and we can choose to start with the metadata or with the granularity discussion first. I put the metadata questions to the chat box, and I can read them out. There are 3 questions, so probably the best to go by question to question. Yeah, so the first question, which was very much the question from the fair data maturity model, that we had a discussion around the fair data model, and it was always, rich metadata, robust metadata, complex metadata, whatsoever, and we could not figure out what the different names mean. So for us, it would be interesting that what is the best to use for in the context of FAIR. The second question, review the metadata standards directory to determine the community standard exists. And the third question, does your metadata follow the existing community standard for your data? So these are the 3 questions for the metadata discussion for the next 20 minutes. I don't know who wishes to speak on 1, 2, or 3. And yeah, you please use the Google Doc as a housekeeping to put your notes in it. All the notes will be saved, and then after we will clean the paper, of course, at the very end.
To the metadata standards directory.
Can I start with a question?
Sorry, George?
So can I start with a question about this?
Absolutely.
Looking at these three questions, I'm wondering if the answer to question 1 isn't questions 2 and 3. In other words, that metadata standards are pretty much by necessity determined by communities, and that we have to allow those communities to set those standards and tell us what adequate metadata is in their communities. I'm not sure that I'm just wondering whether there is a way to separate the idea of rich and robust from the community standards. Now, there is another perspective, which is something that I've been working on with a couple of people, which is connected to the DDI cross-domain integration work, which is what happens to metadata when you move metadata from the way that one community depicts metadata to the way that another community depicts metadata. And I can talk about that if you want, but I'm inclined to think that you can't really separate 1 from 2 and 3, and that 2 might be the answer to 1.
For me, it's fine. Yeah, I just like to say for the history that the maturity working group did not define the rich metadata or the robust metadata. It was the heritage. Yeah, the FAIR principle were already defined, and we had a great discussion, but we decided to do not change the FAIR principle wording. Therefore, we use the wording of the FAIR principle in the maturity model. And now the question, if the standard is the solution, then of course we have to replace it. Yeah, so I just wanted to tell it for history. Francois, you wish to say something?
Yes, I am very conscious of community role in all that, so I understand very well what George was saying. I think that for me, the rich metadata is something which allows users to find, to reuse, and to interoperate data. There are metadata aspects in those 3 functions. And so the ideal definition of rich metadata is that users are enabled to find, reuse, and interoperate data. Then in practice, we go back to what was just said, which is that it's fully dependent on communities, and the communities are not at the same level with respect to these 3 things. And you have seen that when you have done your survey, since interoperability disappeared, more or less, somehow. So I think that there is something in which I completely agree that in the current aspect, in the current situation, the 2 following points are defining something which is important for FAIR in practice now. You also have to note that the metadata standards directory may not be the only directory with standards. So this has to be taken into account, but it's a detail compared to the definition aspects we are discussing. So I think if we take the FDMM as a goal and something to tell people to progress, they have to think about progressing in the definition of their standards, and in particular of their metadata standards. So it depends if you want to measure fairness now, or if you, with respect to the situation as it is in the community, or if you want to push people to progress somehow.
If the idea of this is to assess the maturity of either a data set or a collection of data sets, and in these terms, you're trying to assess whether the metadata that they have is sufficiently rich and robust. I think it is, it's tempting to try and reduce this down to a kind of single number, but we need to be aware that there will be differences depending on the context. So the rich adjective comes up is mentioned in both the finding and the reuse sections of the principles. What is rich enough for discovery is not going to be exactly the same as what is rich enough for reuse. And I think there's, we always have to be mindful that when we're judging metadata, we have to judge it in the context of a particular use case of something that we are trying to do. And there are, the community standards are absolutely important for using data within that community, but as George was saying, when we get into multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research, the standards there might be different because we're dealing with multiple different communities, and it's thinking about how we separate out those two aspects and whether we judge them slightly differently depending on those two kind of use cases.
Any other opinion? And maybe just to say, that the fair data maturity model output is now available. And the question that do we have to revisit it in the next 2 years? If we cannot offer a better solution, then it will remain as it is today. So the question that with the progress of all the data solutions, there is a need to change it or not at all. If there is no need to change or there is no possibility to change, we will remain what we have in the model right now.
I am not sure that this discussion will help to know what has to be changed. I have always pleaded to have real usage by as many people as possible and to gather feedback.
Absolutely.
Because, when we discuss interoperability between different communities, I think that if you want to do generic interoperability, the situation is not ready. If you want to do interoperability beyond very basic criteria. And so the situation is potentially evolving on that aspect. And as it was said, use cases is really something important, especially for interoperability between communities, because again, generic interoperability, I think it's too much for the moment as an aim. But I also think that there is a real need to gather feedback, especially on the priorities. I have said that many times already, on the priorities which are put on each of the criterion, because these priorities are very discipline dependent potentially. And I think that it's one place where you need to get feedback. And I think that granularity is probably another aspect in which you will get feedback about the difficulties when you need the metadata and the metadata are not on the right place. And I am not sure this will be discussed now. There is something in which the discussion is merging the discussion on metadata and granularity, because where is the metadata? If you have a data collection and you want to find a specific data in a collection, you can have part of the metadata at a different place. And then how do you deal with that with the criteria? I am not sure. I think it was a really open question when we discussed the FDMM before it was set up. So, and again, when we examined FDMM in the EOS context, we really thought that there are things which have to evolve and steps which will come. And so a stepped approach and the capacity to have the priorities evolve depending on the community and depending on time also.
Thank you, Francois. Any other contribution to this discussion? We still have something 5 to 7 minutes on this topic. Yeah. So anybody to the question 1, 2, or 3?
Yes, Heinrich. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Heinrich from German Climate Computing Center in Hamburg. And as well, I'm working on U.B2Find. And so for generic metadata aggregators, it's of course good to know which granularity levels the domain-specific data providers or metadata providers are using. So if I got it right, so there is already a survey about different community-specific granularities. Is there? So what would be good? I don't know. It's just an idea that we have a registry or a survey or collection of domain-specific granularities, because I know that a lot of research domains and disciplines, disciplinary research infrastructures have a very good defined granularity, and it's good to know which, yeah. Okay.
I'll try and answer this, or well, maybe not answer it, but reply. If this document or resource exists, I'd be glad to know it. So I'm one of the chairs of the RDA Data Granularity Emerging Working Group, and yeah, I'm not aware of this resource, of such a resource, but if that already exists, that would be great. But in any case, we are planning in our working group activities to conduct a survey to get exactly this information is one of our goals. So yeah, while I don't think it exists, we are to create this. But if this already exists in some form, it would be lovely to have someone share that.
Yeah.
But I just a little bit more, I guess, on that topic. We've talked about certain use cases of different communities through our working group meetings so far, and I know even within domains, like I'm in the oceanographic domain, and there is not consistency within that domain for sure. So it varies quite significantly from one institution to another, how granularity is done. So, but
yeah, it's challenging, and I don't know if it's a feasible idea to have a collection of specific granularities. So for generic metadata aggregators, it will help. So because often they harvest only on a specific level of granularity, but the discovery, to discover the granulars should anyway possible.
I'm just reading the comment here about from Francoise about you may want to find the data collected by an instrument or the data observed in specific condition by any instrument. This will be different granularities in the same community.
Yeah, this makes it more complex. Yeah, it's maybe it's too various and it is too high. Yeah.
May I ask a question? Because I think that what Francois said, that we have to look the use cases and learn from the use cases. So my first question would be that do you think it would be helpful if we would ask the use cases to report back and feedback on the granularity, especially when they introduce the FDDM model? And my second question that so far, the use cases were mostly within the domain, and the interoperability element was kind of not there because the use cases were not about two different domains and where the interoperability played. And we do not really wish to lose the interoperability element with the FDDM model. So what would be your suggestion for those two questions?
May I ask a question before someone responds? Is to make sure I'm understanding. With use cases, are you referring to a specific set of use cases that you have generated in your working group, or are you speaking more broadly?
No, my question was that when we recognize the use case of the FDMM model and somebody sending the feedback, do you think it would be useful to ask a question if the granularity issue was a real issue for them or not when they use the maturity criteria? So that's my first question. And my second question, that how we generate the experience from the interoperability and efficiency of the fair data maturity model or the challenges regarding the different granularity level and metadata, when the use cases are mostly from a single domain. Yeah, so we haven't seen so far a multi-domain application or use case.
So I'll start, and Raina, you probably have a comment as well. I would think the answer to your first question is yes. So when people, the idea, if I'm hearing correctly, is when people are giving feedback on the fair data maturity model, that's a touch point to be able to ask them what are their experiences and challenges and granularity. So if I'm hearing that right, I think that's a great.
And I see Francois chatting, yeah. So the question for us, and maybe for us together, that how we can generate the multi-domain use cases where we can investigate and check the challenges together from the metadata granularity or the criteria perspective.
I am not sure you will generate them. I am not sure you will generate the cases, but you can ask the community if they have case examples. Because in some domains, people are doing cross-disciplinary usage of data. And then you have to start from real hands-on expertise in a sense.
Absolutely.
I would suggest.
Yeah, but my question, Francois, that how we find those multi-domain cases?
You can only do it by asking the RDA community. And maybe you can ask the people from the disciplinary groups if they have cross-disciplinary expertise. You know, in Europe, in the clusters, there is some cross-disciplinary expertise eventually. So this can, and there is lots of discussion about generic metadata, general, how to make different metadata models communicate from different disciplines. There is lots of discussion about that, I mean. And B2Find is part of the discussion, to my knowledge. So
exactly.
there is expertise. There are discussions ongoing in Europe, for instance, about that.
I know that when I was presenting an example of granularity, like of the oceanographic domain, back in November at the plenary, then interesting comments was someone from the more health sciences domain who might be interested in oceanographic data for the sake of like samples that had come from the ocean that were used in like pharmaceutical industry, and how to find maybe more samples similar like that, or with similar properties or whatever. And they were saying like one thing that would be helpful is just to know how to navigate the granularity within like the oceanographic domain. So just to have a published source of information about how to navigate it, kind of like what you were asking about, does the survey exist about? So I guess even if there was consistency in a domain, that would help a lot, even if it wasn't cross-domain, as long as they could find that resource.
It is easier to make connections between two schemas, two metadata schemas from one domain and another than many metadata schemas in one domain with many metadata schemas in another domain, of course.
Yeah.
But this is something which does not exist in many domains, a single metadata schema, I would say. In many cases, there are many. And again, B2Find knows that very well.
Yeah. So I absolutely agree with Rosa. So we can collect it via the RDA. So, but as well, for sure, it's a high variety, and you will not find for one community or one specific research discipline one granularities data model, but many.
Yes.
But to start with it and to ask people, and here as well, metadata aggregators as B2Find can help, because we know already the metadata schema, otherwise we cannot map on the generic. But in my proposal as well was to the B2Find maintainers, Claudia and Annalena, that they as well collect the data granularity, specific data granularities. So anyway, they have to know, because they have to know how the data is aggregated and collected and will only harvest on a specific level. Yes, I think it would be very useful and helpful to have such a survey. It will be never comprehensive. So, but actually at the end, to cover the whole research landscape or the main.
I think if we think about collections and individual data, it can help in your idea. Because one way to organize things may be to think about data collections, at least to have two levels, not 20, but at least to have two levels, the collection level and the level of the data which is in a collection. And this could be a pragmatic, to check if this makes sense in different communities could be a good output of your survey.
I was thinking too, like when talking about maybe the relationships between the metadata schemas, like thinking, really looking at the ways that they represent the relationships to other entities, like is part of or depends on, or like these kind of linkages that exist, so that you could map these from one schema to another to be able to navigate them more easily somehow, like for the collections and the granules. And one comment about that, maybe two-level collection versus like collection and data set or whatever, is I find that the granularity between data sets and collections is not necessarily hierarchical, that one data set could actually belong to more than one collection depending on how you define it. So, and because you're trying to serve different use cases for discovery and whatnot. So I guess whatever mechanisms are in place, I think it has to be flexible like that to be able to go up and down or move around in based on some traits of some kind.
It really depends on the community. Yeah, for example, I come from climate research, and there we have for the World Data with Climate Center at least, we have a very clear hierarchical granularity. So experiments, data set groups, data sets, and the files. So, but others, for example, I discussed this a lot with Dan Bruder and Peter Wittenberg in Clarin, so in the language sciences. They have as well a lot of granularity, but there's other semantics already. So for sure they have not experiments, but data set group is very abstract. So, and as you said, maybe we can check how we can map different hierarchical, if there is a hierarchical granularity, to abstract common level 1, level 2, level 3. I don't know if this will until to the bottom most fine granular.
Sorry, I come in. I just like to remind ourselves that we have 15 minutes left for the metadata questions. If we wish to visit them, it has to be our choice if we wish to move or not. But I suggest that we move now to the second part of the discussion around the metadata, if you would agree. And should I read the questions again? Yes. So the metadata questions, that what the rich metadata, robust metadata mean, review the metadata standards directory. I think that I wrote those questions. Wait a moment. Regarding the granularity, I don't see now the granularity questions. So the granularity question was that, in your experience, what factors drive the granularity used? What role can and should issues the granularity play in fair assessment methodologies? And feedback on the working group plan direction. What would be the most useful for the group to support the model? What of the granularity questions can be used to inform the model? Yeah, so these are the remaining questions where we didn't make a comment yet, or partially did, actually.
I was just going to say, if you wanted to talk about the other metadata questions first, you know, the directory and things, that's fine too. And I'm not sure if anybody from the metadata interest group is, it's hard to know who's on what room. So, but I think maybe Alex is in this room.
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean,
But again, then, yeah.
Where we've used up over half the time now. So,
but
yeah.
I guess I'm not sure we've talked about metadata enough. What have we talked about the directory enough? What should we talk about next on metadata? I guess is the question.
Yeah. Anyhow, I think that we can continue as we started. Yeah. So anyone who wishes to speak, please do.
Kate, you've the last part here says comment on the WG's planned direction. Can you say a little bit about what the discussions within the group about what your direction is going to be? Anything more than what you presented earlier?
In the FDM model?
Yeah, on the, well, I'm looking at the granularity discussion questions. And question 6 is, you know, is asking for help on which direction the group should go. I guess I'm asking people on the group if they can say, well, you know, start us off by saying, here are the things that we've been thinking of doing.
I can share my screen again to do that. So hopefully you're seeing a PowerPoint slide with just a reminder of what our key focus is outline planned for the group. So to explore questions and share information for how people.
Katerina, may I ask you to go to the slideshow mode because the letters are very small.
So yeah, sometimes when I've done that, it's not worked in.
Okay, now it's better. Now it's bigger.
Let me have faith. Can you see it now?
Yeah, better.
Okay. So a lot of the focus at the moment is it's such a complex area. We want to not jump into solutions, but ask a lot of questions around what kinds of challenges are people having with granularity before we move into providing guidance to help people make choices around that. And I think in general, so the process is trying to first explore and understand what are the issues and practices around granularity, and then the end point is to produce use cases and then a document for organizations to say, these are different approaches for granularity that you can consider using as a mechanism for making decisions. So is that enough? Is that too broad still, or is that enough information to give a response?
Link from to our case statement. that goes into more detail about the plans. Although there'll be some tweaks, I guess, as we resubmit, but the gist of it is there.
And we understand not everybody will have read that before this call, so this is not the only opportunity. But George or others, would more sort of prompting information be helpful?
Yeah. I see Francois' comment, and I very much support Francois that we have to start from the practices. Mm-hmm. But actually, and it's a question to ourselves, that once the outputs are ready, the community start to use the outputs, and our way to get all the feedback is not always straightforward. Yeah, so some people reporting back, some people don't, some people open their experience. Some people don't. So then, how we can make sure that actually the community understands the need and the necessity of the evolving and progressing data solutions to improve them. That the feedback is as much necessary as the working group normal work is. Yeah, I know that it all depends on the personalities and the people like you, Francois, who know the community by name for a very long time. Yeah, so we need people like you. But how we do it in the terms of isolation? How we do it in the times of COVID, when the personal interactions are much less there?
I just wanted to add to one piece of what's in our case statement, specifically that also is related to some of the conversation earlier in this discussion about the metadata elements. So we have in our work plan to really take a look at the different registries and metadata standards that are already out there, and to try to determine, like, within those, what are the metadata fields that constrain or relate or have an impact on the granularity choices that one can make in those registries or schemas. And so we do give some examples in the case statement about that. And, you know, in some schemas, there are very clear granularity choices that you must use. In other cases, it's, you know, pretty arbitrary. So that is part of our plan too, and that might help to untangle some of what we've already talked about earlier in this conversation.
So if I might jump in with a comment, I thought that the slide that Keith Jeffries, who I believe is in the breakout group, showing there was left and right and different ways of thinking about. It looked to me like there were different ways of thinking about granularity, where at the bottom on the left was a value. I forget the term that Keith used. I would call it an instance value, which is at the very granular point. That must be a helpful way of thinking about this. And I especially like the point that Keith made about it, that we impose structures on these, but I would say that part of the problem here is that the structures that disciplines impose on these values are different in different disciplines, and that I mean, my limited experience in this is that the place that people can agree on of what a data, you know, what the smallest part of data is a value, and that if you get them to build up from there, they're going to go in different directions. And so that having a conception like what Keith presented in your discussions might be useful in building your way up to a common conversation, which in my experience can be very difficult. It's the language that matters, and the languages used in different disciplines I'm surprised at how different they are and how difficult those conversations can be.
Of this is, yeah, really contested. That's a good way to think about when we do the survey, to get to, to find out what's happening in the different communities, is just to really maybe look from that smallest granule, how they build up from there, and then see if we can extract, well, what we can extract out of that information as a starting point. But I do agree that the value is the only starting point that probably each domain or group will agree on, and then widely diverges.
Are there other sort of challenges regarding granularity that people have faced that we haven't talked about?
Need help from the FDM working group members if they have any questions left, which we can be discussed in the remaining 2-3 minutes. I do not have any further question on my own. And I don't know if again somebody from the metadata group is here or not. If not, then maybe we can use the remaining 1 minute for a short break and go back to the room if there are no more contributions.
Well, I mean, if you want, I'll just put in a final plug for the the metadata standards catalog. Obviously, other places for recording and registering your metadata standards are available. But if you do, have a domain standard that you feel is underrepresented, then do make sure it is in a metadata standards catalog that is appropriate for your domain. We would absolutely love it if you could add it to the metadata standards catalog. It is something that is maintained by the RDA community, so anyone from the RDA community can come in and add to it and help to maintain the information that's in there. So that's all I wanted to say about that, really.
To say that as a summary, I welcome the idea of Francois to organize a specific workshops. Maybe we can do somehow together the granularity, the metadata, and the FDDM working group, to have a common learning points. And I like to suggest that we go back to the main room now.